I have carried many men. That is the first truth. On stretchers. On my back. By the shoulders. By the wrists. Under fire. Through mud. Across fields already torn open by artillery. Down roads that had forgotten they were roads. Into aid stations lit too dimly. Into trucks that smelled like blood and wet canvas and fear. I carried men who begged. Men who prayed. Men who apologized for their own weight. Men who cursed me for touching wounds that had to be touched if they wanted a chance at seeing another morning. Men who called for mothers, wives, God, whiskey, mercy, more morphine, less pain, somebody named Anna, somebody named Joe, somebody named nobody at all. I carried so many strangers that for a while it began to feel like my hands belonged less to me than to war. That was what I did. That was my function. That was my answer whenever people later tried to make something noble out of what I had become. Medic. A simple word. Short. Useful. Almost clean. It sounds like healing. But the truth is, a medic learns quickly that war does not hand out healing in generous quantities. War hands out minutes. War hands out chances. War hands out improvisation, pressure, cloth, blood, speed, and a constant humiliating awareness that skill is often nothing more than a disciplined way of losing slower. Still, I saved men. Enough of them anyway, that the ones who knew me afterwards sometimes called me one of the lucky ones. One of the useful ones. One of the good ones. A man who brought people back. And that is the second truth. I brought back strangers. But not my brother. That is the line everything in my life bends around. Not the shelling. Not the marches. Not the medals, if there were any. Not the noise that lived in my nerves afterward. Not the smell of blood that could still rise in memory from a clean white kitchen towel if it folded wrong in my wife's hands. No. The line is him. The boy I grew up with. The boy who knew me before war knew me. The boy I taught to throw a ball. The boy whose fever I once sat through when he was 12, changing cool cloths at his forehead because our mother was too tired to stay awake another night. The boy I promised our mother I would bring home. There are promises a man makes because he means them. There are promises a man makes because everyone in the room needs one. This was both. And now I am old enough to admit that some promises should never be made in wartime, because war hears them and takes offense. So I am speaking now because I can feel time thinning around me. Because the body has begun doing what bodies do when they have worked too long and loved too many dead. Because I no longer wish to be remembered only as a calm pair of hands and a practical silence. Because my children grew up with the gentlest possible version of me and still somehow inherited the weather of what I would not say. Because my brother deserves more than the one-sentence history would allow him. Killed in action. Killed in action. As if action were the true story. As if he had not once been a boy who whistled badly and forgot his boots by the door and believed, for an entire summer, that he could train a barn cat to fetch. Let me begin before I failed him. Before I learned how expertly the human hand can stop another man's bleeding, and how utterly powerless it can become when the wrong body is the one calling for it. Before my work became a kind of prayer conducted in mud. Before my brother's face began appearing in the features of every half-conscious boy I leaned over afterward. Let me begin when medicine still felt like mercy and brotherhood still felt like promise instead of accusation. My brother's name was Samuel. Sam to everyone but our mother, who only used his full name when she was worried or trying to make a point she hoped would survive longer than supper. He was 5 years younger than me. That matters. 5 years is enough to make one boy feel older than he really is and the other boy feel watched more than he likes. When we were small, I believed it was my job to know things first. How deep the creek ran in spring. Which boards in the shed floor had nails waiting. How to tell a horse from a mule at distance. How to fix a hinge badly enough that it would hold until father returned and fixed it correctly. How to lie to mother without insulting her intelligence too openly when we came home muddy after being warned twice to stay away from the low fields. And Sam believed, with the beautiful recklessness of younger brothers, that whatever had not yet killed me probably would not kill him either. That was our first war. Him following. Me pretending not to notice. Then noticing anyway. Our father was not a doctor. No one in my family was. But he understood flesh the way men who work with tools and animals often do. How things tear. How joints swell. How blood can be stopped if a man does not panic before his hands arrive. He spoke little while doing such work, as if pain deserved efficiency more than commentary. My mother had the opposite gift. Where father brought order, she brought presence. She knew how long to sit by a bed, how softly to enter a room where fever was making a boy strange, how to keep fear from becoming the loudest thing in the house. I think whatever became useful in me later was born in the overlap between those two forms of care. My father's hands, my mother's patience. I was not one of those boys who grew up dreaming of medicine as vocation. No child names the thing that accurately. I only knew early that injury pulled me toward it instead of away. When another boy split his lip or broke his wrist or came down with something sharp and hot in August, I did not grow faint. I leaned in. Not from cruelty. From curiosity first. Then from usefulness. Then from the simple revelation that panic in a room is rarely the same thing as help. By the time I was old enough to choose a direction for my life, medicine had chosen some part of me already. Not fancy medicine. No polished city practice. I studied enough to train properly as a medic because that path felt close enough to meaning and practical enough to satisfy a family that distrusted abstraction. When the war widened and began collecting sons from every road and farm and factory town in the country, I enlisted not in spite of my medical training but because of it. I told myself that if men were going to be broken, then I would rather be near the mending than the breaking. That sentence sounds noble now. It was only partly noble then. The truth, less flattering, is that I also thought being useful in that way might grant me some special arrangement with fate. As if saving enough other people might place a small protective hand over my own family. There is no superstition more human than the belief that service can purchase exemption. Some enlisted later. Too soon, our mother thought. Too soon, I thought too, though I said it in a different tone. He had always wanted to catch up. To step into my shadow and outgrow it in one movement. When I trained in medicine, he learned engines. When I left, he felt the old younger brother pressure to prove that his life was not merely the waiting room of mine. I told him not to enlist. I truly did. It was one of the only times in our lives he saw me not as older, but as afraid. He laughed. Not unkindly. The way younger brothers laugh when they suspect the concern is love, but have no intention of obeying it. Funny, he said. I spent half my life trying to keep up, and now you want me to stay home. I want you alive. He leaned back in the chair as if considering this not as command but whether. Everybody wants that. That's not an answer. No, he said. It's the only answer there is. Then, after a pause, the part that would wound me later. You're going. Why should I stay? I had no argument pure enough for that. What was I meant to say? That I had chosen usefulness and he was choosing danger? That his life mattered to me in a hierarchy I had no right to impose? That I would rather patch up strangers than risk seeing my own blood across a dressing station? So I said what men say when truth is too exposed to carry into speech. Because mother can't lose both of us. He looked down for a while. Not defiant. Not ashamed. Just young in the way the young become young again when their mothers enter a conversation about war. Then he said, very quietly, she won't. That was when our mother came into the room. Whether she heard anything before that, I never knew. Mothers often know enough before the doorframe confirms it. She stood there drying her hands on a dish towel as if domestic work could still out-argue history. I remember the exact way the late afternoon light touched the edge of the table. I remember the dust in the window. I remember my brother not looking at her directly at first, because boys know they are about to hurt their mothers before the words are spoken. And I remember what I said, what I promised. I'll look after him. My mother turned to me then, not because I was older, but because she needed there to be one usable thing in the room. You swear. I should have said no. I should have said war is too large. I should have said nobody can swear that honestly. I should have said I can love him or try for him or carry his name or write you if the worst comes, but I cannot swear a battlefield into obedience. Instead I said, I swear. My mother nodded once as if signing some internal contract she did not believe in but required anyway. I have spent the rest of my life standing trial inside that nod. War did not bring Sam and me together right away. That would have been too dramatically tidy. At first we were in different places, different units, different rhythms of fear. That made it easier, in a twisted way. I could imagine him safe because I could not see him. Distance protects fantasy for a while. My work as a medic consumed me quickly enough that imagination had little leisure. The wounded came in waves and singles and broken clusters. Shrapnel, bullet wounds, burns, shock, infection, torn limbs, belly wounds that made every man in the tent quieter because we all understood how thin the odds became when the inside of a body opened to weather and dirt. The first months taught me what medical training had politely left out. Not the anatomy. Not the drills. The scale. One wounded man can fill a room with urgency. 20 wounded men can turn urgency into math. Then morality enters and the true damage begins. Who can wait? Who cannot? Who is still salvageable? Who is already leaving no matter how well you dress the wound? Which hand you place first, knowing that your first choice may indirectly condemn the other man still breathing 3 feet away. People imagine battlefield medicine as an uninterrupted performance of compassion. Compassion is present, yes. But so are triage, resentment, fatigue, disgust, tenderness, numbness, panic disciplined into function, and the terrible daily education that not every body asking for you can actually be kept in the world. I learned speed. I learned compression bandages in mud and darkness. I learned to cut fabric faster than fear. I learned how to move toward screaming and how to distrust silence. I learned to smell shock on men before they fully entered it. I learned how to say "stay with me" in a voice calm enough to make a stranger borrow my confidence for another minute. And I learned something uglier too. How quickly the mind, if it wants to remain useful, begins rationing imagination. You stop picturing mothers. You stop wondering what each man wanted to become before history requisitioned him. You stop looking too long at photographs tucked in tunics. You stop asking who wrote the last letter folded soft from rereading. You stop because otherwise your hands slow, and slowed hands kill. So I became efficient. That is a word praised too easily. Efficient can mean competent. It can also mean emotionally frostbitten in exactly the areas your work cannot afford to feel at full volume. There were times, after my first year, when I could eat standing beside blood and not notice the obscenity of that until later. Times when another man's open wound became, in the first second of sight, less tragedy than task. That frightened me. Then it became necessary. Then the fear of not feeling enough was itself filed away with all the other luxuries there was no room to keep at hand. I wrote home when I could. My mother's letters came less steadily than before but carried more pressure in them. She always asked after Sam. Have you heard from him? Have you seen him? Is he eating enough? Did you tell him not to send me sugar if he can use it himself? Does he sound tired? Do not let him do anything foolish. As if younger brothers in war needed permission to be foolish. As if war itself were not an institution built to industrialize the foolishness of the young. I answered honestly when I could. No, not yet. Yes, I heard from him. He sounds all right. He says he misses your bread more than your advice. He says to tell you he is taller than me now, which remains false. I tried to keep her supplied with him, as if detail could function as medicine. Then, after long enough, chance or bureaucracy or divine irony brought us into the same broad theater of the war. Not the same unit. War seldom grants such sentimental arrangements cleanly, but close enough that movement, paperwork, and the strange coincidence by which large systems occasionally produce intimate consequences finally crossed. I still remember the first time I saw him again in uniform. He looked older and younger at once. Older in the face. Younger in the eyes, which still carried some embarrassing confidence that the world owed him continuity. He grinned when he saw me. That familiar, infuriating younger brother grin that had survived everything except caution. Well, he said, if it isn't my personal insurance policy. I hit his shoulder. He hugged me too hard. And there, in the middle of that machine of war, for one impossible minute, our mother's kitchen returned. The fields. The creek. The years before uniforms. That was the danger. That was the tenderness. Seeing him made him real again in a way letters had not. And because he was real, my fear became specific. I began checking on him when I could. Too often, perhaps. He noticed, of course. One night, after a bad day and a worse evening, he sat on an overturned crate beside the aid station and smoked half a cigarette he had no interest in finishing. You know, he said, it's insulting how often you look at me like I'm already bleeding. I said, occupational hazard. He leaned back. No, brother hazard. I did not deny it. Then he said softer, I'm not a child. No. You don't have to keep trying to hold me over your head like one. That stung because it was half true. Part of me still thought my age gave me jurisdiction. War does that too. It confuses love with command. I said, Mother made me promise. He smiled, but there was tiredness in it now. Mother made you promise because she loves us both. Not because you can actually stop artillery. I looked away. He let the silence sit, then said, You know what bothers me? What? You act like if something happens to me, it'll be your failure. As if the war is organized around our family. I wanted to tell him he didn't understand. That blood is not reasonable. That if I lost him, I would indeed experience it as failure no matter what any textbook, priest, or commanding officer might say. Instead I said, just keep your head down. He laughed. That's the whole strategy? For you? Yes. What I did not say was this. If I can keep you ordinary, maybe I can keep you alive. That is what older brothers believe when the world turns hostile. That advice might stand in for shelter. The day I lost him did not begin with omen. I distrust stories that grant disaster too much choreography. No black birds. No last beautiful sunrise. No prophetic sentence delivered over coffee with the right amount of tragic irony. Just weather. Mud. Noise. Routine thickening into danger. We had already been taking wounded before the shelling worsened. That matters because memory often prefers a clean before and after. Real war is messier. Men were already bleeding. I was already working. Hands already red. Bandages already running short in the way supplies always do when the official arithmetic of war collides with actual flesh. Then the bombardment intensified. A medic learns to hear change in artillery the way a sailor hears weather turning. Not exact trajectory. Something subtler. Density. Pattern. Intent becoming immediate. The station shook. Dust fell. Men flinched even while being treated. New casualties began coming faster than the old ones had finished needing us. Everything narrowed. Pressure here. Tourniquet there. Shout for plasma. Move him. No, not that one first. He can wait. This one cannot. No, not him. Yes, now. Where is the morphine? Who took the shears? Whose blood is this on my sleeve? Whose blood is any of it? A medic in full movement does not think in paragraphs. He thinks in fragments violent enough to keep another body attached to itself for one more minute. Then I heard his name. Not from him. From someone else. Sam's hit. That is all. Or nearly all. I turned before I fully understood I had turned. The body sometimes outruns language where love is involved. He was coming in on a stretcher. Mud everywhere. A darkness spreading through the field dressing already. One hand still gripping fabric as if he had intended to arrive under his own authority and had merely been interrupted. There are moments in life so clear they feel as if they were etched, not lived. His face when I first saw it. That is one. Not fear first. Recognition. He knew me. God help me, he was conscious enough to know me. And because he knew me, he smiled. Not broadly. Not foolishly. Just enough to suggest that some younger pre-war instinct in him still believed I belonged to the category of things that made bad situations survivable. That nearly destroyed me before I had even begun. I moved to him. Someone else was talking. Wound details. Time since hit. Possible internal damage. Pressure dropping. The usual language catastrophe wears when men are trying to keep panic professional. I heard it. I did not hear it. He said my name. Not medic. Not anything military. My name. I leaned over him and said the first lie every medic learns. You're all right. He looked at me with that same infuriating younger brother perception. No, he whispered. I'm not. Then, because he was still my brother even there, he added, you look worse. I almost laughed. Almost. We moved him inside. I worked on him. Or rather, I joined the effort already underway, because love does not exempt a man from the procedural truth that a body in a dressing station belongs first to the wound, not the relationship. This is where ethics and blood become enemies. If he had been a stranger, I would have evaluated him as any other casualty. Severity, bleeding, breathing, response, likelihood, intervention sequence. Because he was Sam, all those judgments arrived burdened. Every decision felt contaminated by intimacy. Do I touch first because he is mine, or is that treachery against the others? Do I let another medic handle him because objectivity might save him, or is that cowardice disguised as fairness? Am I looking at the wound clearly, or through memory? Can a man be a brother and a medic at the same time without failing one role by serving the other? No training answered that. War is full of situations institutions know will happen and still never teach properly. He had taken a bad wound. Bad enough that even saying more now feels ornamental. Blood loss. Internal damage likely. Pain increasing. Shock stalking him with professional patience. We worked fast. I knew his face too well. That was the problem. Every grimace contained childhood. Every breath held my mother's house somewhere inside it. I could not reduce him to task the way I had learned to reduce strangers in order to save them. I needed to. I could not. He grabbed my sleeve once, hard. Don't let me. He didn't finish. I said, don't talk. He squinted at me as if this was a familiar old dynamic. You always say that. I put pressure where it needed to be. Called for what we needed. Answered other voices. Fought the wound. Fought the clock. Fought my own face. Because medics do not get to frighten the wounded with their fear. He asked if it was bad. I said, stay with me. Not an answer. A command. A plea. A superstition. He obeyed for a while. That is one of the ugliest mercies in war. The dying often continue trying to help you do your work. He tried to breathe the way I told him. Tried to hold still. Tried not to say how much it hurt until the body made honesty unavoidable. At some point the world narrowed down to his eyes. The sounds around us receded. Not fully, but enough. The whole war moved to the edges. He said, in a voice suddenly young enough to split me open, "Did you write home?" I said, "Not yet. Tell Ma I was fine." "You'll tell her yourself." That sentence. That stupid, ancient sentence. Every medic says it. Every dying man knows what it means. He looked away then, not because he was fooled, but because he was kind enough to let me keep pretending for one more second. Then he said the thing that has never stopped. "Don't make this yours." I stopped moving for the smallest fraction of time. Not enough to matter medically. Enough to matter morally. What? His breathing caught. He swallowed against pain. "Don't do that thing. Where you take it all in." Even then. Even bleeding out. Still reading me better than I wanted read. I said, "You stay with me." He almost smiled. "Bossy." There came a moment, and every medic knows this moment, though we do not always admit how clearly we know it, when the body in front of you begins withdrawing from negotiation. Not dead, not gone, but reallocating its allegiance away from your hands. A dropping pressure. A shallowness in the breathing. The wrong kind of pallor. The eyes trying to focus from farther away. I knew. Not as brother. As medic. That knowledge is one of the cruelest professional privileges I have ever been given. He saw it in my face before I could hide it well enough. And then, because he was Sam, because younger brothers remain younger brothers even at the edge of death, he reached for humor once more. "Ma's going to kill me." I made a sound somewhere between laugh and grief. It embarrassed me then. It embarrasses me now that embarrassment still matters to memory after all this. I told him not to say that. Told him to save his breath. Told him we were still working. Told him all the lies mercy allows. Then he said, very quietly, "You promised." There is no sentence more terrible when spoken by a brother who is dying in your hands. You promised. Not accusation. Not anger. Just fact. I said, "I know." And in that moment, I understood something I had never let myself understand before. The promise had not been to my mother alone. It had become a promise between us. He had lived all this time partly inside it. So had I. And war was taking it apart. He was frightened then. Of course he was. Only fools and liars strip fear from the dying. But he was also brave, if by brave we mean continuing to look at another human being when the body is breaking and still thinking of what burdens that person might carry afterward. He squeezed my hand. A weak squeeze. A child's squeeze almost. Then he said, "You couldn't stop this." I wanted to believe him. I have spent years trying to believe him. He added, after a pause, "Tell her I knew you came." That was the last coherent gift he gave me. Not long after that, he left. No bougle. No grand speech. No cinematic stillness settling over the whole station in respect. War does not stop because your brother dies. That is one of its dirtiest facts. He died while other men still bled in the next rows. While someone shouted for more dressings. While another body was carried in. While my hands, traitorous in their competence, still knew exactly what to do next for the living. I hated my own professionalism in that hour. Not because it was wrong. Because it continued. I remember looking at my hands and feeling offended by their steadiness. How dare they remain useful after failing the one body I had spent years privately imagining I might somehow be spared from losing? I did not get to collapse then. There were too many wounded. That is the answer nobody likes, but it is the answer war gives most often. No time. No room. No exclusive right to grief. So I washed my hands. Or tried. Then regloved. Then moved to the next man. That motion, more than death itself, became the blade. To continue is sometimes the deepest wound of survival. I wrote to my mother before the army did. That much I made certain of. I would not let a typed notification reach her before my own hand did. Whether that mattered in any measurable sense, I cannot say. It mattered to me. I wrote the letter in stages. Started and stopped. Tore one up. Sat with another half page for hours. There is no grammar sufficient for telling your mother that the son you swore to protect died while you were touching him and still could not keep him in the world. So I wrote around the wound. He was brave. He was not alone. He spoke of home. He knew I was with him. He did not suffer long. That last line. Again that old temptation to shorten death into mercy on paper. Did he suffer long? By military standards, no. By brotherly standards, infinitely. My mother wrote back 3 weeks later. The paper looked as if it had been folded and unfolded too often before the final version was mailed. She did not accuse me. That would have been easier. She thanked me for being with him. Said she had prayed for one of her sons to reach the other if the worst happened. Said now she would choose to believe God had answered that much, if nothing else. Then one line, near the end. You did not fail me by surviving him. I have held that sentence most of my life without fully trusting it. Not because I distrusted her. Because guilt is a louder interpreter than grace. After the war, I came home with skill in my hands and ruin in my sleep. That is perhaps the simplest description. I married. Worked in medicine some years, then around medicine, then away from it and back again. Because once war has taught your hands how quickly flesh can leave the world, ordinary life feels both precious and absurdly fragile. I became the sort of man people rely on in emergencies. Calm. Practical. Steady. Those qualities are often just trauma wearing a respectable suit. I could hold pressure on a wound without shaking. Could sit beside a hospital bed for hours. Could tell frightened families what to expect in a voice they trusted. What I could not do for a very long time was speak of my brother as anything other than event. Not Sam. The wound. The station. The promise. The failure. That is what guilt does. It flattens the dead into the shape of the moment you lost them. It took me years to understand that this, too, was another kind of betrayal. Because Samuel was not born in a dressing station. He was born in a spring storm. He once swallowed a marble and lied about it. He hated mushrooms. He could not whistle well but kept trying. He once broke his wrist falling out of the barn loft because he believed, against all evidence, that rope could be trusted if a person wanted adventure badly enough. He was a whole life. And for too long I remembered him only at the point where mine failed to save his. What finally opened me was not heroism, not therapy, not confession sought for my own soul. It was my daughter. She was grown by then, older than Sam had ever become. That alone was strange enough to ache. We were sorting old things after my wife died. Boxes, drawers, receipts nobody needed, photographs everybody dreaded. She found a picture of two boys by the creek. One taller, already trying to look responsible. One squinting into the light as if suspicious of being told where to stand. "Uncle Sam?" she asked. I said yes. She looked at the photo a long time. Then she said very gently, "You only ever tell us how he died." Not accusing, just accurate. That sentence hit with a precision I had spent decades avoiding. Because she was right. I had turned my brother into a wound and called it remembrance. That night I did not sleep. I sat at the table with the photo, an old letter from my mother, and the full useless weight of every year in between. By morning I knew two things. First, I was running out of time. Second, if I did not speak of him properly before I died, then war would get the final edit on who he had been. I could not allow that. So I bought the recorder. And now I am here. An old man with reliable hands and unreliable sleep, trying for once to tell the whole truth instead of the useful one. Samuel. You were here. You made mud look personal. You argued with weather. You followed me into every dangerous place available when we were boys and into the worst dangerous place available when we were men. You wanted to prove you were not living in anyone's shadow, and God help me, you succeeded more thoroughly than I ever wanted you to. You were funny when frightened. You were kind when exhausted. You still tried to spare me at the end for making your death the center of my own identity. I heard you. Too late, perhaps. But I hear you now. You told me not to make it mine. I made it mine anyway for many years. That is one of the things I am apologizing for in this room. Not for grieving you. I had the right. For carrying you too long as accusation alone. You were not just the brother I couldn't save. You were the boy by the creek. The son at my mother's table. The fool in the barn loft. The man who asked me to tell her he knew I came. I did come. That remains true. I could not stop what happened. That also remains true. Both truths can live together, though it took me most of a lifetime to allow them the same room. If you are listening to this and you have ever loved a medic, understand something plain. We do not only remember the men we lost. We remember the men we almost kept. The men who trusted our hands for 5 more minutes. The men who apologized while bleeding. The men who called us by our first names when everyone else around us had become rank and function and blood type and urgency. And if one of those men shares your mother, your childhood, your jokes, your first fishing spot, your scars from before the war, then no amount of training prepares the body for that. No manual. No code of triage. No doctrine. Because battlefield medicine is built to serve the living. Brotherhood is built to destroy objectivity. When the two meet over one body, something in the medic is almost certain to die, even if the body on the table is not his own. Part of me died with Sam. Not all. Enough. Enough that every life I saved afterward felt slightly counterfeit for a while, as if the hands had proved themselves and failed themselves in the same hour. Enough that my wife learned not to touch my shoulder suddenly when I was washing blood from some ordinary kitchen cut. Enough that my children grew up sensing that their father's calm came at a cost they could not name. Enough that I spent years helping strangers live while privately unsure whether usefulness could still be called goodness after the one failure that mattered most to me. Old age has changed some of this. Not the pain. Pain is stubborn, but the architecture around it. I no longer believe my brother's death was a referendum on my worth. I no longer believe surviving him automatically made me false to him. I no longer believe guilt is love in a more honorable coat. What I do believe is simpler and harder. That witness is a debt. That the dead deserve proportion. That brothers deserve more than being remembered at the angle of their wound. So let this stand as witness. Samuel was not only the body on the table. He was a whole weather system of life. And I, old now, am finally trying to remember him in the shape he lived, not only the shape he left. Before war, an older brother believes he can keep a younger one safe through skill, warning, love, or sheer force of concern. During war, he learns that care and control are not the same thing. After war, if he survives, he spends the rest of his life learning whether forgiveness can exist without forgetting, and whether memory can become something other than a private courtroom. I do not know if I have arrived there completely. Probably not. But I know this. Silence was not protecting him anymore. It was protecting my preferred version of grief. I am done with that. This is my voice. Old now. Steadier in sound than in sleep. Still carrying the field station in my hands sometimes when I wake. And this is what I want left behind. My brother died in war. I was with him. I could not save him. He knew I came. He was more than the way he died. I loved him before the war. I love him still. That is not closure, but it is truer than silence. And if tonight, after I turn off this recorder, I see him again in sleep, if the station returns, if the blood returns, if the promise returns, perhaps one thing will be different. Perhaps I will remember, before the wound opens, the creak, the rope, the barn loft, the badly whistled song, the younger brother trying to keep up. That is where I would like to leave him. Not dying. Still there. Still laughing. Still mine.